Good afternoon. Welcome to this event on maintaining the momentum in U.S. India relations. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. Today's discussion is timely, to say the least. Last week, the Quad leaders, India, U.S., Australia, and Japan, met for the first time and committed, among other things, to an extremely ambitious plan to provide 1 billion doses of coronavirus vaccine to Southeast Asia. The Quad leaders also reviewed regional security issues. They talked China, and they discussed ways to deepen cooperation on technology and in other areas. For those who watch the U.S.-India relationship, you'll know that it's a really rare instance in American foreign policy of a sustained bipartisan approach that's been driven by a strategic objective over a couple of decades now. So from the doldrums of bilateral relations for much of the Cold War and its immediate aftermath, the final year or so of the Clinton administration saw a major turn. The transformation of ties between the US and India during the Bush administration, built upon quite significantly by the Obama administration and then the Trump administration. And now it's been embraced and strengthened already just 60 days into the Biden term. There's looming challenges in the U.S.-India relationship, as there always are, but it's hard to think of another bipartisan foreign policy initiative that has lasted as long and that holds out such significant strategic promise as that of forging closer ties. So today, we're going to talk about the relationship, where it is, where it's going, the possibilities, and the challenges to it. And there's literally no one better to do this than the speakers that we have joining us today. Lisa Curtis directs CNAS's program on Indo-Pacific security. She served for 4 years as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for South and Central Asia on the National Security Council staff. She departed in January. Rich Verma served as U.S. Ambassador to India from 2014 to 2017 during the Obama administration. He's also an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS, I'm pleased to say. And Ken Juster served as ambassador to India from 2017 until January of this year. So hopefully his jet lag has worn off now that he's back. The three of them have many other credentials, but it gives you a sense of their backgrounds on the issues that we are talking over today. I, once upon a time, was a humble India desk officer at the State Department. So I'm very seriously outranked, but I'm going to do my best to hang in there with this group. Thanks to the three of you for joining us, and we'll get the discussion started. For the audience, I'll ask the speakers some questions. We'll turn to you for your own questions. If you have something you'd like to ask, put it in the Q&A box, and we'll also do a couple of audience polls, as we usually do in these kinds of things, so we can get a sense of what the participants in this event are thinking. So anyway, thanks again to everybody for joining us. Ken Juster, maybe I can start with you. And I wanted to start with a sentence from your farewell speech that you gave before departing New Delhi. You said, "We cooperate," this is a quote, "we cooperate on defense, counterterrorism, nonproliferation, cybersecurity, trade, investment, energy, the environment, health, education, science and technology, agriculture, space, the oceans, and so much more." That's a lot of bilateral cooperation, certainly relative to where we used to be and relative to many other countries. My question for you is, what does this add up to as a strategic measure? Is the relationship with India ultimately about balancing China? Is it about uniting two democracies because we have an affinity for each other's political values? Is it about something else? How do you think about what all these various forms of cooperation add up to when you think of the relationship between the two countries?
Well, first of all, Richard, it's a real pleasure to be here with Rich Verma, Lisa Curtis, and yourself. I've worked with CNAS and other projects over the year, and I've worked with you on India issues, and you minimize the importance you've had in the relationship, which has been very significant. As you say, the relationship has grown tremendously over the last 20 years, in part when President George W. Bush pushed the transformation of the U.S.-India relationship. He had the simple idea that the world's oldest and the world's largest democracy should get along better with each other. But it's really taken on increased strategic significance over the years. And I think what all of the different areas of cooperation point to is the fact that as the Indo-Pacific region, which has really become the center of gravity of international affairs. It's got the largest countries in terms of population, in terms of economies, a vast bulk of international trade goes through it. It's got enormous natural resources. But as this region becomes really critical to the international system, having a strong democratic India that has a positive relationship with the United States is a critical pillar for stability and prosperity of the region. And so strategically, this is a country that we have an interest in seeing its own advancement. In addition, the international environment itself is undergoing great change with the rise of China, with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and with an overall slowdown of economic growth. And India is a critical player in addressing each of those challenges. And so a strong U.S.-India relationship, and expanded out further to that with other like-minded countries such as Japan and Australia, as epitomized by the Quad, which we worked on significantly during the Trump administration and we're delighted to see has been embraced wholeheartedly by the Biden administration, again, is key to bringing stability and prosperity to this region. And the Indo-Pacific set of principles, inclusive one. It is not meant to contain a particular country, but it is meant to say that there are certain principles that we all want to see flourish in this region, and it's to be open and free. By international law to prevent predatory financing or coercive economic behavior, and to promote freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight. And so the U.S. and India really are two key pillars in trying to promote that set of principles. And that, I think, is the strategic significance that underlies so much of what we do, and that itself is anchored by the enormous people-to-people relationship between our two countries, epitomized again by over 4 million Indian Americans that are leaders in the United States.
Great, thank you. Lisa, let me go to you and maybe if you can give your own sense of this, but also just to expound a little bit on the China angle here. How much of U.S. interest in India and Indian interest in the United States is driven by worries about China's weight and assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific? And you know, you're not in government anymore, so you can speak as freely as you would like and all these things like that. So, you know, what effect did the India-China border crisis in 2020 have from the outside? It looked like it's helped India shed a few inhibitions, both with respect to the Quad and respect to some of the specific aspects of the bilateral relationship, some of these agreements and so forth. But is that a right reading that, you know, we have Xi Jinping to thank a little bit for, you know, helping grow the U.S.-India relationship?
Yes, thank you, Richard. I think that's right. I think the China angle definitely contributes to the U.S.-India partnership. But I also think Ambassador Juster is right that it's not the only thing. We've seen this relationship grow over the last 20 years because of India's economic growth and growing importance, the recognition of its democratic voice and how important that is on the global stage. All of these factors have contributed to growing the U.S.-India relationship over the last 2 decades, really. But I would say that the relationship took on even more significance, particularly in the last year following the 2020 India-China border crisis. And what we saw is that this really was a seminal event, I think, in India's calculations, both on its relationship with the U.S., its relationship to the Quad, in seeing more openness to the Quad. And I think it will impact sort of broader Indian national security thinking for the foreseeable future. It was just one of those kind of very important, impactful events for India. To the extent that India took steps to lessen its dependence on China's economy, India banned, nearly 200 Chinese apps, put investment restrictions on Chinese investment, held up imports for a while from China. So we certainly saw India react in different ways than we had seen in the past during previous border crises with China. And the U.S. responded. The U.S. Provided information, intelligence that was very helpful for India. We expedited military gear, particularly winter gear for India, as it would have to keep troops through the winter on the border. So it's certainly, I would say, in the last year, China's aggressive behavior on India's borders has strengthened the U.S. India relationship, or at least caused India to draw even closer to the U.S. and shed some of that reluctance that it has had. In the past, there was talk of India being equidistant between China and the U.S. We no longer hear that. It seems clear that India recognizes that to the extent that the U.S. has continued strong influence in the Indo-Pacific region, that benefits India.
Great. Rich, let me go to you, and then Ken, I'll bring you in on this after Rich, but you may have thoughts on this, what we've already talked about, Rich, but also I wanted to ask you specifically about the Quad and the Biden administration's sort of really rapid move in the first 2 months to convene the first leaders summit, these kind of ambitious things. Do we just have Kirk Campbell to thank for all of this, or is this, how do you think they were able to make sort of such progress here, and some of the vaccines, but also the first joint statement, the commitment to meet in person at the leaders level later on this year, and things like that. So, one, kind of, what do you think's fueling such rapidity, and the other is, how do you think this evolves in through the administration as they work this?
Yeah, Richard, thank you. And it's really great to be here with you, fellow Senate staffer of many years ago, with Ambassador Juster, with Lisa, 3 really good friends. And I appreciate you taking on this important topic. This 20-year period is so important, and you've all mentioned it. We've only had this upward gain in U.S.-India ties for 20 years. 20 years in the foreign relations of the United States is not a very long time. And so, I think we should take a step back and recognize how much actually took place. Virtually nothing happened from the mid 60s up until about the late 90s. And in fact, we were you described it as doldrums. We were in a really bad place in the early 70s. You can actually, if you really want to go back further, which I won't, go into ancient history, but President Eisenhower and President Kennedy actually planted the seeds for what we're talking about today. When we're talking about the Quad and cooperation across the Indo-Pacific, this really goes back a ways. And so I'm so glad these ideas have finally been put into practice. But let's go back to 2000 and just look at some of what was going on, right? So Tony Blinken was a White House staffer working on President Clinton's trip to India. Joe Biden was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who would soon work and take the civil nuclear agreement to fruition. So these were not ideas that came to them in the last 50 days or the last few years. They've been working on U.S.-India relations for a long time. And the real beauty of what's happened over the last 20 years is this bipartisan, almost nonpartisan treatment of India. And each administration worked on the good work of the prior administration. So the work that Ken and Lisa did to bring the Quad to where it is today, it allowed the team to come in fast and actually stand up this leader level meeting with the commitments on climate and vaccines and on technology and standards. So we're actually seeing the output of this of 20 years plus in the Quad. That's why they were able to move so fast. And I will just say personally, I worked with Jake and Tony and with candidate Biden on these issues over the course of the campaign. They were talking about them over the last year on the centrality of India to the free and open Indo-Pacific. And yes, a lot of credit to our mutual friend Kirk Campbell for driving this forward. So there's a lot of reasons for the success, and I'm really excited as to what they what they laid out here. And I think the Quad is one part of the architecture as we go forward. And we can certainly talk about what the future architecture looks like, but I think it's one piece and it's an important piece.
Oh, that's great. I think those are really important points about the other actors and how long they've sort of been thinking and working on these issues. I mean, going back to when, as you say, then Senator Biden sort of helped lead the charge on the India Civil Nuclear Agreement. Ken, I'm going to come to you in just a second. Rich, I just want to follow up on one thing because it's connected to a question that's coming from Dana in the audience. And it's about the role of human rights in the relationship. And I actually wanted to ask you about this bipartisan sort of nonpartisan thing you just mentioned. So, there's been rising concern about, the Modi government and illiberal tendencies and Hindu nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, part of the glue here, part of the attraction is the liberal democratic nature of our two countries. And I suppose Indians would be fully within their rights to look at what's happened in this country recently and say, we don't see a model for how to, at least protect the capital and so forth. So, is that going to be a hindrance? Is that going to move Democrats in one direction, Republicans in another, or people who care more about human rights and democracy in one direction, and people care more about the strategic relationship in another? I mean, is this just something we can manage along the way?
Yeah, I think this is where we have to take a step back and say, what is this relationship and what holds it together, right? There's obviously an idea about the free and open Indo-Pacific, liberal democratic order, our security relationship. There's an economic component to our relationship that is critical, that will hold us together. But look, the reason this relationship is special is because of shared values and a commitment to certain ideals. And that does make us different. And those sets of ideas go back a long ways. And our colonial experience, our commitment to democracy, our shared commitment to inclusiveness, to minority representation, all those issues are what actually make this partnership really actually different. This is not supposed to be a transactional relationship. This is not about buying and selling things to each other. This is about standing up for each other. So look, we've gotten close enough, I think, over 20 years where you can sit down at the table and you can talk about everything that's going well, and you can talk about things that are not going well. And that doesn't mean somehow we're estranged or we're falling back into our Cold War doldrums. It means we have an advanced relationship where we talk about issues that matter. Look, if I was on the Indian side, I would talk about what's happening in the United States. I would talk about the strength of our own democracy, which I am concerned about. I am concerned about how minorities are treated here, about treatment of Asian Americans. I think all of that should be on the table, just as we, as the United States, should be able to share our concerns. That should not be a dividing line between Democrats and Republicans. If you care about this relationship, you talk about this set of issues, and it should be a mutual conversation.
Ken, I wanted to come in and I think on maybe the China issue, but maybe if you could also add a thought or two on this last point about how does this actually work in practice? I mean, you're off the sort of front lines here. How much of this is part of the conversation, and how do you deal with that?
Okay, let me sort of touch on a few issues. First, on China, the one thing I wanted to add was, despite the fact that India and China have always had some friction in their relationship, it had been relatively stable for 45 years. And the Indians had felt they could manage this relationship. There were informal summits between Modi and Xi. And the border issue was compartmentalized and kept apart from the broader relationship. What the events of last year in May and June did was change that completely. And the Indians do not compartmentalize the boundary relationship. That has dominated concerns, and it has infected everything else. And although the Chinese would like to treat it as a separate, discrete issue, for the Indians, it's been a huge loss of trust with China, and something that will have long-time consequences even as they try to figure out how to disengage and hopefully de-escalate as well. So that has had a dramatic shift, and then we saw it by having the Quad meeting at the end of October among ministers in person during COVID in Tokyo, which I think then gave a impetus for the Biden administration. I congratulate them and applaud them to quickly move on that, even though there was some speculation at the outset, will the Indo-Pacific maintain its conceptual framework, and will the Quad move forward? With the appointment of Kurt Campbell at the NSC and other measures, they've really embraced it and moved forward in the way that both you and Ambassador Verma talked about in terms of bipartisanship. And it's also important that the people that have worked on this relationship on both sides of the aisle have been involved for a number of years, and so we talk to each other, and you know, we get involved in fora such as these and other track 2 dialogues. So there's a broad consensus that enables that to go forward. And in the Quad, you had the other members of it still in their positions to move on that. On the final point, you know, we've raised issues. We have an annual human rights report. We have a trafficking persons report. We have a religious freedom report. We raise these issues. India is perhaps a little less focused on internal issues in another country, so they don't raise as many concerns with us. But the question is, I don't think it will. It'll be an issue to be discussed, and in some respects, if there's something egregious, can present challenges, but I don't think it's going to divert us from our broader strategic perspective. And I think the issue that one really has to manage is how much of this do you do publicly and how much do you do privately, where I think you can be more constructive and positive in the way you approach the issues.
Right. That makes total sense. Why don't we key up one of the audience poll questions? We can see what folks who are tuning in are thinking about this. Somewhere behind the scenes, Shai Corman, also known as DJ Shai, is going to give us the results. So here is the question about looking ahead to 2030. How strong do you believe it'll be compared to today? And in a minute or two, we'll see what folks have to say. But Lisa, actually, this is a good way of teeing up a question that has come in from Donald in the audience, who says, even though India is, say, quote, partner rather than ally, we don't use the term ally, are we getting closer to that goal of frequent, constant, across the board consultations with Delhi? I mean, are we sort of approaching alliance asymptotically, never to actually be touched, but the closer we get, the better? Or can we even imagine, you know, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, an actual alliance between the United States and India?
Yeah, I don't think we can count on an alliance, a military alliance with India, even in the next decade. India very much treasures its strategic autonomy. And even though I talked earlier about how the U.S. India relationship has become closer, India's become more willing to be associated with the U.S. and we exercise, military exercises are held constantly between the U.S. and India. The Quad, as we've talked about, has been strengthened. But even so, I don't see a formal alliance between our two countries. I certainly don't see the Quad becoming a military alliance or an Asian NATO, as some people have referred to it. But I would say it is possible to envision that 10 years from now, we have everything short of an alliance, that we have, you know, drastically improved our trade. I think even though the trade issues are still very difficult, the market access issues, Ambassador Juster works very closely on these issues and understands the frustrations that we have in terms of Indian market access or market barriers and tariffs and such. So right now, I think it's a little bit difficult to see that, but I do think that we have that potential, and a lot of that is because of the people-to-people linkages, the fact that you have so many Indians studying in U.S. universities, and you know they want that connection, the educational, the research connections. We really saw this in the early days of the pandemic. Ambassador Juster and I worked very closely on a lot of salient issues on the economic front. For example, the pharmaceuticals, the fact that India is one of the largest producers of pharmaceuticals, and the fact that people needed access to those pharmaceuticals. And there was a lot of concern in the early days about India restricting those. So that shows our interdependencies and India's importance as an economy to the U.S. Also, with the back office operations, we worked hard to make sure that the back office operations could stay open. U.S. companies relying on hospital billing, financial issues. So I think we have seen that close relationship on the economic front, the people-to-people front, and now we are seeing the importance of the strategic relationship in the form of more training, more defense cooperation. Last year, the U.S. completed the sale of $3 billion worth of naval and attack helicopters to India. We were able to complete the final defense enabling agreement. So now we have the 4 key defense enabling agreements signed between the U.S. and India. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of the Quad and what that has done for even the U.S.-India relationship and our ability to cooperate across the board. And, I just want to note that it really is extraordinary that the Biden administration was able to hold the first ever leaders level Quad meeting within 60 days of coming to office. And it was the first joint statement of the Quad. That's pretty extraordinary. And if you look at the details of the vaccination campaign, the campaign to increase production and distribution to Southeast Asia, I really think that it's really quite extraordinary, the work that's already been done on the Quad. And that will contribute to strengthening U.S.-India relations so that we will see, I think, quite, we can't even really envision what we'll see in 10 years. But I think it will be everything short of military alliance.
Great.
Richard, can I just add to very quickly what Lisa said? The alliance, and that was a great answer. The alliance question, we always look at it from the Indian perspective, that the Indians don't want to enter into an alliance. I actually think we have to ask that question back in Washington too. Do we actually want to be in a military alliance, not just with India, but with a new partner tomorrow or next week? I think of the alliance structure, there's a reason we haven't entered into a mutual defense partnership like we have with our friends in Japan or Korea. We haven't done it in over 60 years. I think of the alliances of the 20th century as very different than what the kind of network of friends and partners we're going to have in this century. And as I mentioned, I think and as Lisa really spelled out well, our partnership with India is going to be this kind of woven together fabric of many different components. And in a way, I think it'll be more agile and more appropriate for the architecture of this century than last century.
Yeah, that's great. Let's go to Shai Corman, who has the results of our little question here, and see what DJ Shai has to say.
Hey there, DJ Shai, a term coined by Kurt Campbell himself. So his hand is felt everywhere here. So first of all, thank you to our audience who've been voting and the tons of folks dropping questions into the chat. So I think what we're seeing here is, I believe the audience is sharing the optimism of the folks here on the panel, because 0% of the people watching see the relationship taking a step backwards, and 52% see it being much stronger, with a little stronger being the one next to it, being the closest next to it. So I think there's a lot of optimism based on our audience, and I'll be back later with additional polls. So please keep throwing your questions in the chat and voting in the polls. Thanks, Richard.
Great. All right. Ken, let me pitch a question here from Christopher that is referred to the military assistance to India during the border crisis. And this is what Lisa was talking about before with some of the extreme cold weather gear and things like that. The question is, how far can that assistance go? Where would India draw the line at that kind of cooperation? I would add, where would would the United States, do you think, should draw the line? I mean, are there limits to what we would do, particularly in the middle of a pretty serious
other point on where this relationship can be 10 years from now? And as Rich and others have said, or Ambassador Verma, sorry for my lack of formality, it would have been hard 20 years ago to envision that the relationship would be where it is today. And so it is difficult to speculate. I think the one area that has underperformed and that still is a question mark is the economic relationship. In defense, in health, in education, and energy, counterterrorism, you see tremendous growth and I think enormous optimism. The economic relationship has never fulfilled its potential, and even now we struggle, not that it doesn't continue to advance, the volume of trade and investment goes up, but as countries try to recover from COVID-19 and its impact on their own economies, India has adopted a policy of self-reliance in part to lessen its dependency on China and to increase domestic manufacturing capability and employment. But will this have a negative impact on the U.S.-India economic relationship, which I think should be an important ballast in the broader relationship? And I hope it doesn't have a negative impact on India's own economic growth, which is so critical to its being able to enhance its defense capabilities and continue to prosper. So I raised that issue. It's an open question, but that's going to be one that is going to take a lot of effort as the years go on. In terms of the defense issues and China, you've raised good points about where would we go next. Thus far, the types of requests that India had, the United States was able to respond to quickly. In fact, having in place the enabling agreements, including the LMOA logistics agreement, made it very easy to do so. The COMCASA agreement on secure communication is also important. So in a sense, this crisis has reiterated for both sides the significance of signing these enabling agreements and to having a tighter defense relationship. But we're still not engaged in joint planning activities and discussing how we would view the world down the road and doing some policy planning and strategic coordination. And without that, it's very tough to conceptualize how you would send equipment to India or things of that nature. I mean, right now, a lot of the equipment is not necessarily U.S. or it's not interoperable. And so these are things that will have to evolve. And there are natural breaks on what we could do without greater joint planning, collaboration, and even sales of U.S. equipment that could then be followed on in a crisis and would be interoperable with other items that we would make available.
Ken, let me just follow up on the economic point you made, and with two kind of specific questions. One is, do you worry at all, or should we worry that the kind of pressures that we're seeing around Buy America, reshoring, supply chains that have capacity on pharmaceuticals or whatever else, given the pandemic that should be in the United States, that will be a hindrance to the growth of the economic relationship? And then the second question I would ask is, what could a good trade agreement with India look like? If you're giving advice to the Biden administration on what they could actually pursue with India on the trade front, what do you think that would look like?
Yeah, on the first question, clearly, as every country, and as I said, this may be accelerated in part by the COVID pandemic, looks to turn internal, that obviously will have some adjustment in terms of their orientation to international trade. The fact is, and it's a misconception, at the beginning of the Trump administration, the average applied tariff rate in the United States was 4.7%. By the end of the administration, it was 4.0%. So although there was some salient acts that made people label the U.S. as protectionist, in fact, it continues to be the most open, large economy in the world. Unfortunately, during that same period, India's applied tariff rate went from 13.7% to over 18%. And we really saw a raising of market barriers as part of that tariffs. So this is a challenge, and it's a policy decision for each country. as to what to do. In my view, I think history shows, especially in East Asia and even in India's own history, that opening up accelerates economic growth and is for your own benefit. It's not done as a concession to another country overall. So I would hope that we would see that. And the United States is India's largest market. India is our 9th largest market. They should want to do a free trade agreement to lock in the benefits of that access and not to be exposed to some limiting of that access. A trade agreement, the type of agreement we were discussing with India during the time I was ambassador, really related to a dispute that had arisen related to the Generalized System of Preferences, which was a statutory U.S. program that requires recipient countries to gradually increase market access. And when several U.S. industries complained that they weren't getting it, we had to investigate that and then try to resolve those issues with the Indians to see if on medical devices, on dairy, on IT products, we could have some small agreement. We were unable to reach that. I still think those areas and some long-standing agricultural issues are the low-hanging fruit to try to get some resolution. But the bigger issue out there is going to be digital and data, and how, as economies turn more to being digital economies, and United States and India are two of the biggest players in the technology revolution, how do we work together? How do we set standards? How do we make sure the Chinese don't set the standards for these areas? And so that's the issue that we've got to tackle. And India's got to itself. Now, they didn't, after 7 years of negotiation, they withdrew from the RCEP agreement that included China. They indicated that they're not happy with their other existing free trade agreements. They've got to decide, what do they do? Because I think if they hang out in isolation from any trade relationships, it's going to damage their economy. And I think it makes sense, and they've talked about negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States, perhaps doing one with Europe, with the UK, and really locking into that supply chain and those relationships. And as I said, helping to determine what are going to be the regulatory standards in the 21st century for the digital world and other areas.
Great. Lisa, I'm going to come to you in just a second. I want to ask you about the Quad, but we have an audience question I want to tee up here just to, see what the audience is thinking here. So if Shai and company can put the Quad question up. So this is about the Quad's top priority, and we'll see what the audience thinks there. The question that came in from the audience that I wanted to ask you, Lisa, and Rich and Ken too, you may have views on this, is the question from Glenn is, if the Quad's the best way for the U.S. to engage with India and Asia, does it make sense to include other countries, South Korea, ASEAN countries, UK, Germany, France, or is it better to keep it limited to 4? So, in any of these kind of groupings, you can either broaden or you can deepen. It's sometimes hard to do both at the same time, but should we be looking for a quint or an octo or I don't know, whatever the Greek would be for some of these other things, or, is the Quad the way to go for now?
Well, I think the way we should look at this is, I think the Quad as the core grouping is very important. You've got 4 powerful countries, which are democracies with powerful militaries. So the 4 can accomplish a lot together, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region. But that doesn't mean it should be a strictly exclusive group. And I think you can bring in other countries on an issue-by-issue basis. In fact, that already happened. In the previous administration, the State Department had brought in South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam with the Quad countries on a biweekly basis to discuss responses to COVID-19. So that has already happened. I think there's interest from other countries to interact with the Quad in that way. So I think there can be sort of a flexible approach to this. The other point I would like to make is that the ASEAN countries, when the Quad was first resurrected back in 2017, had expressed concern that the Quad might displace ASEAN as a regional grouping. But it's been very clear that these two groupings serve completely different purposes. ASEAN has been important for a long time. It will remain very important as a way for these countries to come together on common platforms over mutual concerns and interests. And so I don't think they should be seen as mutually exclusive. In fact, with this recent vaccination initiative that was just announced last week, what is happening is the Quad are pooling their resources, coming together with, the U.S. and Japan providing financing for India to increase its production of vaccines, Australia helping with the distribution of those vaccines to Southeast Asia. So ASEAN countries can see that they're actually benefiting from work that the Quad is doing. And I think that's very positive. And if you look at the joint statement that was issued by the Quad countries, they specifically reference ASEAN and its importance, and that the Quad will not be displacing ASEAN. They're making that clear in the joint statement. So I do agree with the question that we need to find ways to involve other countries on an issue by issue basis with the Quad, but that as the core grouping, I think these four countries can operate more effectively if they remain the core group that is trying to make some of these changes. And that, when it comes down to it, is the goal is to maintain a free, open, rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific.
Ambassadors, do you guys have the same view of, for and no mas for the core group, or?
Well, Richard, what I would say here is that we talked in that poll question about whether in 2030 things would be better, and everyone assumed it would be. And what I don't want to have happen is that we lose focus on the bilateral relationship. The Quad is exceptionally important, but it is one piece, and there's so much. In order for that upward trajectory to continue over that next 10 years, there's a lot of tending to and a lot of work that needs to be done. On the defense side, building out India's status as a major defense partner, which no other country in the world has that status. Increased complexity of naval exercises, air exercises, building maritime domain awareness. I'd love to get to where we have a real conversation on advanced military equipment like 5th generation fighter. I know that's hard as we're talking about India going forward with its S-400. Those are difficult questions that have to be resolved. And eventually getting, as Ken said it better about, joint planning, but really some degree of burden sharing. And whether it could start with humanitarian and disaster response. This is not the U.S. and India going out to do joint patrol somewhere, but this is about India playing a lead role across the Indo-Pacific. And on the trade front, we don't even have a bilateral investment treaty with India. We've got to start somewhere. If we can get a bilateral investment treaty, get this mini deal that Ken and Lisa worked on for so long, and then go to the FTA, I think that's great. And I would say there's a lot of work to do on climate, health security. And yes, then the Quad Plus for like-minded countries to talk about supply chain resiliency, again, global health security. So again, there's a lot that can happen to make that trajectory for the India 2030 and the U.S. to be a great relationship, but let's not lose sight of the bilateral components as well.
Ken, let me come to you in just a second. I just want to go to Shai real quick and get the results of this question we've asked the audience.
Well, here we go. We've got, I think thank you, Richard. The big winner here is United Diplomatic Front to contest China. What's really interesting is as we watch the polls unfold, interoperability among the Quad militaries was circling 0 for a while until we got later into the conversation. So that one got some fans and took a little bit of a took a little bit of a lead there. Actually, digital influence went up to 14% by the time this was all said and done, and we locked in the results. So those two tied, and then development assistance, including infrastructure, that came in second. So it's interesting to see that the military piece is something that our optimistic audience is not necessarily that optimistic about. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Richard.
All right. Thanks, Shai. Ken, so if you want to say anything about the Quad, and Rich mentioned the bilateral investment treaty, which when I was an India desk officer 18 years ago, we were writing into the talking points that we need a bilateral investment treaty and we need it now. So some things move fast, some things less so. But on this question of the S-400s, what should we do? Do you think the president should issue a waiver from the sanctions or sanction the Indians if they take delivery of it this year?
Okay, let me quickly say that I thought both Lisa and Rich made excellent points. The Quad should be a flexible format. It's a core. We should be happy to coordinate with other countries on issue-by-issue bases. I was going to say, in response to your question, Richard, that we should have a dodecahedron. My uncle, who wrote a famous children's book that had the dodecahedron as a character in it. But I think the Quad should be the core. And
the dodec.
Yeah. So. But I think Rich makes a very important point. Let's not lose sight of the bilateral relationship. That's the one we've got to keep building. And the Quad does not replace that by any stretch. On the S-400, I'll give you my point of view, and I'm going to be writing something on this shortly. This legislation was designed to affect Russia. It wasn't designed to harm our partners or allies such as India. Through secondary sanctions, we are raising the specter that India could be sanctioned. I think this is crazy in the sense that India is a partner that is moving closer toward us. By raising the issue of sanctions, we are just raising doubts in their mind about how reliable a long-term partner the United States can be. The fact is that India has a historical basis of having acquired equipment from the Soviet Union and later Russia. That's not going to change overnight. There's some equipment that they acquired that we don't provide. There's some that they came to us that we weren't willing to sell at one point, but we are now. I think that's good of the S-400. And we don't really have the same capabilities. But the very notion of discussing sanctions with a country that we're trying to build a positive relationship with, I think is detrimental to the relationship. So there are different ideas out there. Do you invoke sanctions if they purchase it, but make the sanctions meaningless? I think we should waive the sanctions issue. And there's still a technology issue, which is, can India continue to acquire sophisticated equipment from multiple countries, including Russia and the United States, without those countries saying, whoa, we don't want our equipment to be mixing with that of an adversary of ours, and there are going to be natural limitations in terms of what technology will be made available, and it will also hinder India's ability to truly be interoperable and to operate efficiently even across its own forces. I'd rather see the natural issues of interoperability, technology sophistication, and coordination be what decide the procurements of India rather than the specter of sanctions, which I think are counterproductive.
Yeah. Could I just add something to that?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I like Ambassador Juster, I've probably been to every U.S. India defense exercise that took place wherever it was in the world. And you come away from that with a great degree of confidence that our forces are really well trained, well aligned, well equipped, and it really you come away with hope for the future. On top of that, we have I think performed the Russian military on our equipment, on our maintenance, our servicing, on our performance, and I do think we can continue to do that. And so I kind of really agree with what Ken said about, sanctions is not the right way to do this. Both countries have to make strategic choices, if I could use a phrase of Foreign Minister Jaishankar. India understands what it's doing by going down this path with Moscow, but and look, we have to acknowledge that Russia has also sold $40 billion in defense equipment to the Chinese. And so this is, I think we can win this in the commercial and strategic space. And I'm not sure sanctions is the right way to prevail.
Let me go to Shai for, actually ask Shai to put up the last audience question, just because it bears specifically on this, or at least this is one of the things that you could see as a potential challenge. And in the meantime, while folks who are watching this are opining, Lisa, there's a question for you from a member of the audience who asked about Afghanistan. I'm going to sort of broaden this out to ask you, obviously President Biden has got an imminent, very big decision to make with respect to the requirement that American troops withdraw in their entirety by May 1st. If yes, then some things; if no, then other things potentially ensue. But how do you see India reacting to, its policy toward Afghanistan going forward, and then also the prospect that Afghanistan would return to, some sort of chaotic situation post an American withdrawal?
So, I think India has been somewhat skeptical of the peace efforts that the U.S. has made. They have not been outrightly critical. I think they've kept, some of their constructive criticism in private, but certainly, I think they are a bit nervous about the direction of the peace process, and of course, the prospect of U.S. forces going to zero. They certainly have benefited by the U.S. counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan. Let's not forget that India has faced major terrorist attacks over the last 20, 30 years, and that the prospect of the Taliban returning to Afghanistan and the reemergence of a terrorist safe haven is likely to hit India before any other country. So this is something they are very concerned about. They've been very supportive of the efforts to instill democracy, to hold elections. India funded the parliament building in Kabul. So a lot of symbolic importance to the kind of support they've provided, and it's been appreciated by the Afghans. When you do polling of Afghan people, often India is seen as very favorable in the eyes of the Afghan people. So I think that you're right. President Biden has an important decision to make. I think it's possible to both extend the U.S. troop presence and keep the peace process going. It's not easy, but I think it is possible, with some rebalancing of that peace process so that we're not just expecting concessions from the Afghan government, but we're also expecting the Taliban to make some concessions to have a genuine peace process. Now, I will say with the new peace plan that came to light, I guess, about 10 days ago, and the idea of the UN taking a larger role in the peace process, I think that seems clear that the UN heretofore will have a larger role in this peace process, particularly in the area of coordinating the regional partners. India, of course, was named as one of those regional partners, which is good because I think India has an important voice on the future of Afghanistan and can play a positive role in terms of the future of the country. So I think, we're probably going to see India take a greater role in the future of Afghanistan now that U.S. and NATO troops are drawing down, now that the UN is taking a larger role and inviting India to be part of that process.
Great. Shai, what's our last set of results here for this question we've got?
So for our last set of results, by the way, thank you to our audience. This was probably the most vigorous voting. It was a real heat, back and forth, numbers up and down. But trade disputes, the clear concern in terms of challenges with human rights and defense procurement with Russia being tied, and not many folks, in fact, zero folks that are at this event, concerned about immigration and visas being an issue between the United States and India, or a major challenge, or the top challenge in the coming years of the Biden administration. And with that, back to you, Richard.
Great. Well, we will wrap up in just a few minutes, but I guess I have two questions left. One is almost a reflection that had 10 years ago, you said we'd be this far into a conversation about the U.S.-India relationship and not said the word Pakistan once, people would have thought you were crazy. So it does show that it's sort of hard to predict in some ways what's lying in the out years. But in my personal view, I thought the Trump administration was very deft and constructive in the way that it managed the Indo-Pac crisis after the shoot down of the Indian fighter and so forth, both in terms of the public messaging, but also and especially the behind the scenes quiet outreach to both sides and all of this. So I guess my question is maybe for Lisa and Ken specifically, and then Rich, I have a different question for you, but is it, but of course, if you want to opine, by all means, was that a successful model of how to deal with, I would say, probably the inevitability that there will be some sort of flare up at some point between India and Pakistan that will be manifestly in our interest not to see get out of hand? So Lisa, why don't I go with you and then to Ken?
Yeah, well, that was certainly a very tense moment for both Ambassador Juster and I in the administration. I'll just mention that when that Indian fighter was shot down, I was literally sitting at the table with the Taliban in Doha and was promptly called out of the room to start working the phones because, of course, the leadership of the Trump administration was all in Hanoi for the talks with North Korea. So there was a lot of phone diplomacy during that particular crisis. It could have really gone the wrong direction. But I think you're right. I think the high level intervention that we saw, working the phone lines with both leadership, Indian Pakistan leadership, and then the fact that the Indian pilot had survived. So there's a little bit of luck there because he had survived. So that allowed there to be a sort of peace gesture that Pakistan could make, which was returning him to India, which very much calmed down the situation inside India, the public clamor, and allowed the two sides to walk back. So, yes, I think there was good diplomacy practiced on the part of the Trump administration to diffuse that crisis. But there also was a little bit of luck involved there too. And so we have to acknowledge that. And then, most people forget that, 6-7 months later, when India announced that it was revoking Kashmir's autonomous status, we had another sort of scary point where we thought that the tensions would flare back up. I do think it helped that Pakistani Prime Minister Khan had visited Washington just 3 weeks prior to that move by India. And it was a good visit, and there was a lot of goodwill established between the two countries. And I think that helped in moderating the Pakistani response to India's revocation of Article 370, which had granted autonomy to Kashmiris. So, yeah, there will always be that concern about the flare of Indo-Pakistani tensions. But I would say two things. I would say it's never a good idea for the U.S. to try to mediate on the Kashmir dispute. That's not a winning strategy for the United States. It's an issue that the two countries must resolve on their own through bilateral talks between the two of them. And the second is that quiet diplomacy goes a lot further, sort of the behind the scenes shuttle diplomacy, going back and forth between the two countries, particularly in times of crises, has been the most effective way to deal with these situations.
Great. Ken, I want to just bring you in the final question that I want to, if you have an opinion on, and Rich is the question I wanted to ask you too, is, as this new team in the Biden administration is taking shape, a new ambassador will go out and all these other kinds of things. Is there one issue that you think is sort of ripe for tackling in the bilateral relationship? You would say, hey, here's an opportunity here. This is the kind of one you should try to go after in 2021?
Well, that's a tough question. Let me just quickly add a footnote to Lisa's excellent answer on the Pakistani-Indian issue, is that to be able to respond well at a time of crisis, you really have to have previously to that built up strong personal relationships and a good bilateral relationship. I think we had that with both India and with Pakistan. I think that helped tremendously, both in India's initial response to the Pulwama terrorist incident, then to the dust-up that occurred between the two countries, and later even to the Kashmir situation. And a lot of this was done behind the scenes. There were a lot of phone calls. I was on the phone with our own, as Lisa said, group in Hanoi, and shuttling back to the Ministry of External Affairs and to the National Security Advisor. But it was built on a foundation of trust that had been established early on, and that's always, I think, critical to dealing with the crisis. In terms of the big issues going forward, as I've said, if you can use the momentum at the outset of administration to make progress on the trade issue, I think that would be very significant for the relationship. I think, again, it's in both countries' interest, but really more almost in India's, which needs to have some trade partners, and we're the natural one. We are the number one market for them. And I think the digital area, while it still has a lot to be defined about it, our two countries have the leading tech industries in the world, and we should be wanting to work together to come up with some of these resolutions. And I think the other area is just to continue to build on the enormous momentum in the defense relationship and to try to enhance interoperability and training, but really to start to talk more tangibly about joint planning and about future contingencies and how we would respond to them. No one wants to see a conflict between India and China, but I think it would be irresponsible of our leaders if we didn't talk about what might happen if that were to occur. So that's something that also should be discussed.
Great. Rich, not if, but when you get the next call from the administration saying, what should we do? What are the opportunities? What are you going to say?
I guess I'd say three things. I'd say work with Congress, bring the Congress into the relationship. They were transformative on U.S. civil nuke, on major defense partner. They're a great way to institutionalize our relationship absent a treaty alliance. So bring Congress in. Second, bring the Indian American diaspora in as much as you can and get them involved on the key issues. Very potent force in U.S. politics. They're interested in using their weight on this relationship. Second, end the divide between the strategic and the economic. We have this line, where defense is over here and economic is over here. To me, economics and trade is very much a strategic issue. Keep the 2+2, but bring back the strategic and commercial dialogue. And then finally, on two big substantive issues, building this digital ecosystem that Ken talked about, common standards, opening up our markets, cross-border trade and data, really important. And finally, on climate, I think there's a huge potential to go back to, when I saw President Obama and Prime Minister Modi negotiating the Paris Climate Agreement, line by line, paragraph by paragraph, that was a real glimmer into what's possible on the international stage on a big issue, transnational issue that's plaguing the globe. So I really hope we can come back to the table and do something on battling climate change together.
That's great. Well, thank you, all three of you, for this great conversation with lots of food for thought. At CNAS, we're doing work to look at the next decade of U.S.-India relations, where some of the opportunities are that you guys just described, and other ones besides, and how the U.S.-India relationship is going to fit into the broader approach that our country takes to the Indo-Pacific. So watch this space for more to come. there. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and Ambassador Verma, Ambassador Juster, Lisa Curtis, thank you for your time and wonderful comments today. Great to have you. Have a good day, and we will talk to you again.